Daniel Wright had always been a light sleeper. The slightest noise, a car passing on the street below, the hum of the refrigerator kicking on, the settling of floorboards could rouse him from even the deepest sleep. It was an inconvenience he learned to live with, aided by earplugs, white noise machines, and blackout curtains that almost transformed his bedroom into a sensory deprivation chamber. So when he first heard the breathing, he dismissed it as the building's ancient heating system. The brownstone was over a century old, with all the quirks and complaints that came from age. Pipes groaned, radiators hissed, and wood contracted in the cold Chicago winter. Just another sound to catalog and ignore. But on the third night, lying awake at 3:17 a.m., the witching hour his grandmother would have called it, Daniel realized the sound had a pattern. 2 seconds in, a slight pause. 3 seconds out, another pause. Slightly longer, then repeat. Breathing. Unmistakably human breathing. He sat up in bed, the covers pooling around his waist, and listened intently. The sound was coming from the wall beside his headboard, the wall that separated his apartment from his neighbor's. He'd met the neighbor only once, a middle aged man named Garrick, who kept to himself and worked nights. Perhaps he was home early, sleeping against the same wall. Daniel tapped lightly on the drywall. Hello? He whispered, feeling foolish. Can you hear me? The breathing stopped immediately. Daniel held his own breath, waiting. 10 seconds, 20, 30, nothing. Relief washed over him as he settled back into his pillows. Just his neighbor, after all. Mystery solved. He closed his eyes and drifted back to sleep. The next day, he found himself lingering in the hallway, hoping to catch Garrick returning home or leaving for work. He needed to ask him, casually, if he perhaps slept with his head against the shared wall. It was a strange question, certainly, but better than lying awake each night wondering. But Garrick didn't appear, and eventually Daniel left for his job at the architectural firm downtown. The workday was busy, filled with client meetings and blueprint reviews, and he nearly forgot about the nighttime breathing until he was unlocking his apartment door that evening. As he pushed the door open, he was hit by a peculiar smell, musty and organic, like damp soil or wet leaves. He frowned, scanning his apartment. Everything looked normal. He'd left no windows open, no food out. The smell seemed strongest near the wall he shared with Garrick. Daniel pressed his ear against the wall. Silence. He knocked tentatively. Garrick, are you home? No answer. He decided to leave a note. Tearing a page from his sketchbook, he wrote, Hi, Garrick. It's Daniel from 3B. Could we chat sometime? I've been hearing some noises through our shared wall. Just want to make sure everything's okay. Thanks. He slid the note under Garrick's door and went back to his own apartment, feeling slightly better for having taken action. That night, he fell asleep quickly, exhausted from a long day. The breathing woke him at 2:43 a.m. This time, it was louder, more labored. 2 seconds in, with a slight rattle at the peak of inhalation, a pause, then 3 seconds out, ending with what sounded almost like a groan. Daniel didn't bother with politeness this time. He pounded his fist against the wall. Hey, I can hear you breathing. It's keeping me awake. The breathing stopped abruptly, but instead of silence, Daniel heard a slow scraping sound, as if something heavy was being dragged across the floor on the other side of the wall. Sound moved away from the wall, growing fainter until he could no longer hear it. Daniel lay back down, heart racing. Something felt wrong, very wrong, but what could he do? Call the building manager at 3 in the morning to complain to a neighbor, breathing too loudly? Call the police? He would sound insane. He didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Next morning, bleary eyed, and on the third cup of coffee, Daniel knocked on Garrick's door. No answer. He tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. His note remained where he'd slid it, untouched. Daniel went to work, but he couldn't focus. Images of the wall, of the breathing kept intruding on his thoughts. By lunchtime, he made up his mind. He'd speak to the building manager, Miss Patel, who lived on the first floor and had been running the place for decades. Miss Patel was in her 70s, with silver hair always pulled into a tight bun and eyes that missed nothing. She listened patiently as Daniel explained about the breathing, the note, and Garrick's absence. Garrick, she repeated, her brow furrowed. There's no Garrick in 3A. Daniel stared at her. But I've met him. Middle-aged guy, kinda thin, works nights. Miss Patel shook her head. 3A has been empty for nearly 2 months now. The previous tenant was a young woman named Kelly. She moved out rather suddenly. I've been meaning to repaint before showing it to new prospects. Daniel felt the blood drain from his face. That's not possible. I've seen him. I've spoken to him. Perhaps you're confusing apartments, Miss Patel suggested gently. Would you like me to show you 3A? I have the keys right here. They climbed the stairs together, Daniel's mind racing. He somehow imagined their meeting. Was he losing his grip on reality? Miss Patel unlocked 3A and pushed the door open. The apartment was indeed empty. No furniture, no personal belongings, just bare floors and walls. See, she said, gesturing around the space. No one's living here. Daniel stepped inside, disoriented. The layout was a mirror image of his own apartment. Where his bedroom was, 3A had a small dining nook. The wall he shared with Garrick wasn't a bedroom wall at all. It backed up to his kitchen. What's behind this wall? Daniel asked, pointing to the wall where he'd heard the breathing. Just the space between the walls, Miss Patel said. These old buildings have thick walls, plaster, lath, sometimes even brick in between units. Beneath the floors or above the ceilings? Miss Patel gave him an odd look. Just joists and subflooring. Why do you ask? Daniel forced a smile. Just curious. I'm an architect. I find these old buildings fascinating. Miss Patel nodded, clearly unconvinced. Well, if you hear anything else, let me know. It's probably just the building settling. These old places talk to us in their own way. That night, Daniel sat at his kitchen table with a glass of whiskey and the building's original blueprints, which he managed to locate in the city archives during his lunch break. The brownstone had been built in 1898, converted to apartments in the 1950s. The plans confirmed what Miss Patel had said, standard construction for the area, with no unusual spaces or passages indicated. But something was breathing in his walls. He was certain of it. He decided to stay awake to confront whatever it was. He positioned a chair against the wall and sat with his back straight, ears straining for any sound. Hours passed. His eyelids grew heavy, the whiskey bottle emptied. Still nothing. He must have dozed off because the next thing he knew, he was awakening with a jolt to the sound of breathing directly behind his head. In, out, in, out. But this time it wasn't coming from the wall. It was coming from beside him, from the empty space next to his chair. Daniel leapt, knocking the chair over with a crash. The apartment was dark. He'd fallen asleep without turning on any lights, and now the only illumination came from the street lamps outside, casting long shadows across his floor. Who's there? He demanded, his voice sounding thin and frightened even to his own ears. The breathing continued, seemingly unperturbed by his outburst. It moved slowly across the room toward the hallway that led to his bedroom. Daniel's eyes strained in the darkness, but he could see nothing, no form or shape to match the sound. He fumbled for his phone, turning on the flashlight function with trembling fingers. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating dust motes and empty air. Nothing more. And the breathing continued, now from the direction of his bedroom. Against all instinct for self-preservation, Daniel followed the sound. Who are you? He called, and what do you want? The breathing quickened slightly, as if in response. When Daniel reached his bedroom doorway, he hesitated, then swept the light across the room. Empty. The breathing now seemed to come from the closet. Daniel approached slowly, clutching his phone in one hand, the other one outreached toward the closed closet handle. With a deep breath of his own, he yanked the door open. Nothing but his clothes, hanging neatly in a row. But the breathing had moved again. Now it came from inside the wall next to the closet, louder than ever. 2 seconds in, with that distinctive rattle, a pause. 3 seconds out, ending with a moan that sounded almost pained. Daniel pressed his ears against the wall, then recoiled immediately. The wall was warm, almost hot to the touch, as if fevered. He stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet and landing hard on the floor. The impact seemed to trigger something, for at that moment the breathing changed. It grew faster, more ragged, coming from all around him now, from every wall, from above, from below. Daniel scrambled to his feet and ran from the apartment, not bothering to close the door behind him. He spent the night in a 24-hour diner across the street, nursing cups of coffee and ignoring the concerned looks from the overnight waitress. The next morning, feeling foolish in the bright light of day, he returned to his apartment. Everything looked normal. No breathing, no strange smells, no inexplicable warmth emanating from the walls. He took a shower, changed his clothes, and went to work, determined to put the night's terror behind him. But questions nagged at him throughout the day. Who had he met in the hallway, if not Garrick? Why had the previous tenant left so suddenly? And what was making that sound in his walls? After work, instead of going home, he went to the public library and began researching the history of this building. It took hours of scrolling through microfiche and digital archives, but eventually he found something, a small news item from 1976. Local man found deceased in apartment, read the headline. The article is brief, and a man named Gerald Caspar had been found dead in his apartment at Daniel's address after neighbors complained of an odor. The cause of death was listed as natural causes, though the exact nature wasn't specified. The article mentioned that Caspar had been dead for some time before discovery, as he had a few visitors and worked irregular hours. Daniel stared at the grainy photograph accompanying the article, a thin, middle-aged man with hollow cheeks and deep-set eyes. The man he'd met in the hallway, the man he knew as Garrick. With shaking hands, he continued his search, digging deeper into the building's history. 2 hours later, he found another article, this one from 1977, just a year after Caspar's death. The building had undergone major renovations, including repairs to several units damaged by water infiltration. Daniel thought of the musty smell in his apartment, like damp soil or wet leaves. He kept searching, and what he found next made his blood run cold. In 1995, a tenant in 3B, his apartment, had filed numerous noise complaints about sound in the walls. The tenant had eventually broken their lease and moved out. In 2003, another tenant in 3B reported a persistent knocking or tapping that seemed to follow them from room to room. They too had left before their lease was up. In 2012, the tenant of 3B actually damaged the walls, apparently trying to locate the source of what they described as whispering voices. They had been evicted and required to pay for repairs. And now, in 2025, here was Daniel hearing breathing in those same walls. When the library closed at 9 p.m., Daniel found himself reluctant to return home. Instead, he went to the hardware store that was open late and purchased a hammer, a crowbar, and a powerful flashlight. If something was in the walls, he was going to find it. Back at his apartment, everything was quiet, no breathing, no scraping sounds. Daniel stood in his bedroom, tools in hand, staring at the wall he shared with the empty apartment next door, the wall where the breathing was loudest. "I know you're in there," he said aloud. "I know who you are, Gerald." Nothing, not even the settling sounds of an old building. Daniel raised the hammer, struck the wall once, twice, 3 times. Plaster cracked and fell away, revealing the lath beneath. He switched to the crowbar, prying away larger sections until he had created a hole about the size of his head. He shined the flashlight into the gap between the walls. Between the walls was a narrow space, perhaps 8 inches wide, filled with dust, cobwebs, and the skeleton of an old pipe system that had long since been replaced, but no sign of anything that could have made the breathing noises. Daniel expanded the hole, working methodically, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air. Soon he had exposed a section of the inner wall space about 3 feet wide and 4 feet high. Still nothing unusual. He was about to admit defeat when his flashlight beam caught something tucked behind one of the old pipes, a small leather-bound book. It was covered, mottled with age and damp. Daniel reached carefully into the hole, stretching his arm to its limit to grasp the book. It came away easily, covered in a thick layer of dust that made him cough as he withdrew it. The book was a journal, the name inscribed on the inside of the cover, Gerald Caspar. Daniel's hands trembled as he opened it, the brittle pages threatening to crumble at his touch. The entries began in 1972 and continued until just a couple of days before Caspar's death in 1976. At first, they were mundane: work schedules, grocery lists, occasional comments about neighbors or the weather. But as Daniel flipped through, the entries grew darker, more paranoid. Caspar had become convinced that someone was watching him, following him. He began to hear noises in his apartment when he was alone, footsteps, whispering, breathing. The final entries were almost incoherent, the handwriting deteriorating into frantic scrawl. Caspar wrote of something that had taken up residence in his walls, something that breathed and watched and waited. He believed it wanted to take his place, to wear his skin and live his life. The final entry, dated 3 days before his death, read simply, "It's inside me now. I can feel it breathing with my lungs." Daniel dropped the journal as if it burned him. The breathing had started again, soft at first and growing steadily louder. But now it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from directly behind him. Daniel turned slowly, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The room was empty, yet the sound was unmistakable. 2 seconds in, with a distinctive rattle, a pause. 3 seconds out, ending with a moan. And now he understood what the rattle was. The sound of fluid in failing lungs. The sound Caspar must have made in his final days as whatever had infected him took over. "What do you want?" Daniel whispered. The breathing grew louder, closer. He felt the pressure in the air around him as if the atmosphere itself had thickened. Then a voice, raspy, wet, barely audible. "A host." Daniel ran out of the bedroom, through the living room to the front door, but as his hand closed around the doorknob, the breathing surrounded him, coming from every direction at once. The pressure increased, pushing against his skin, seeking entry. He struggled to open the door, but his limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. His lungs burned, his breathing synchronizing involuntarily with the rhythm that filled the apartment. 2 seconds in, rattle, pause, 3 seconds out, moan. With the last of his strength, Daniel wrenched the door open and stumbled into the hallway. The pressure immediately lessened, the breathing faded to a distant whisper. He collapsed against the opposite wall, gasping for air. When he could breathe normally again, he looked back at his apartment door. Inside, everything appeared normal, except for the gaping hole he smashed in his bedroom wall and the scattered tools on his floor. Daniel never returned to apartment 3B. He left everything behind. His clothes, his furniture, his life. He stayed with a coworker until he could find a new place, explaining that there had been a plumbing emergency in his building. 6 weeks later, passing by his old building on his way to meet new friends, Daniel noticed a "for rent" sign in the window. Both 3A and 3B were available. The sign proclaimed, "Newly renovated, move-in ready." Daniel almost kept walking. Almost. But curiosity, or perhaps something more insidious, made him pause. He crossed the street and peered up at his old windows. Through the glass, he could just make out a figure standing in his former bedroom. A thin, middle-aged man with hollow cheeks and deep-set eyes. The man smiled and raised a hand in greeting as if he'd been expecting Daniel. Then he turned away, disappearing into the depths of the apartment. Daniel hurried away, his heart pounding. That night, in his new apartment across town, he lay awake, listening to the silence, grateful for the absence of breathing in his walls. But just as he was drifting off to sleep, he caught it, faint but unmistakable. 2 seconds in, with that distinctive rattle, a pause, 3 seconds out, ending with a moan, coming from somewhere inside him, and Daniel realized, with a cold certainty that settled in his bones, that he hadn't escaped at all. He'd merely provided transportation. The thing that had lived in Gerald Caspar, that had been waited decades in the walls for a new host, was now nestled inside him, breathing with his lungs, waiting to fully control. Daniel tried to scream, but his body was no longer his own. His chest rose and fell in the familiar pattern. 2 seconds in, rattle, pause. 3 seconds out, moan. And somewhere deep inside, he heard a voice, raspy, wet, triumphant. "Thank you for the new home. Your walls are much warmer than the old ones."